O'Neill.
Here.
All right, the first item is approval of the regular city council meeting minutes of May 27th, 2014. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion approved.
Second.
Any discussion, corrections? All in favor?
Aye.
Any announcements, Mr. O'Neill?
I have none at this time.
Mr. Pavlik?
Nothing this either, Mayor.
Any comments from the public? Mr. Brown?
I have observed and complained about the city manager and the city council.
Mr. Brown, if I interrupt you for a second, I need your name and
Tom
your...
Brown, 7436 Candlelight Court.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I have observed and complained about the city manager and the city council refusing to abide by and enforce city ordinances 05-536, F2, F3, F4, and F5. I met with the city manager, Tom O'Neill, in his office on February 14th, 2014. In the course of our conversation about the fence across the 5-foot wide public easement behind 7447 Candlelight Court, he said, "That is an egress easement." At that time, I didn't know what an egress easement was. At that point, I figured that's it. This case is closed. My complaint has no merit. I went directly home and got out the dictionary to look up the meaning of egress. Now I know it means a way out, exit. It is no wonder that on May 6, 2014, Tom O'Neill denied saying that, because City Ordinance 05536 F4 states no fence may be allowed in an easement recorded for ingress, egress, access purposes. I had Jackie Calloway on my side until she spoke with Tom O'Neill, Jackie Calloway of ABC Action News. He told her that Lake Cox is not a natural body of water. It was or is a retention pond, and therefore the city ordinances do not apply. This body of water that is identified on Pasco County maps and Plat Book 2, page 50, as Lake Cox has been there for 32 years that I know of. The level has not dropped in 32 years more than 1 foot, even during 2 long droughts. I have a pickup truck, and I was going to volunteer to haul all of the city ordinances to the dump, but I think they should just be put in a vault until we get a city manager and a majority city council that will abide by them.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Anyone else from the public? Okay, seeing none. Any comments from council?
I'm going to address Mr. Brown's complaint again. I think for clarity, I would like to see in written form at the next meeting the city's position on this complaint and why they feel it is legal.
Okay.
Was that
Nancy?
was that not sent to us an email from the city attorney? I thought maybe that we had already gotten it. Didn't you send that?
I don't remember putting anything together.
As far as Mr. Brown's scenario, you know, I talked to the attorney, and he basically said that he felt as though there wasn't much more that we could do as a city, that maybe Mr. Brown could go to like small claims court or something. That's I don't know if you said that directly, but
It was something to that effect regarding the easement issue.
okay. The other thing is last night we had a meeting with Pastor Lord and City of Newport Richey, because we're still working on trying to determine how we're going to fix the issues that we have in the community as far as crime and whatnot. And I just wanted to report that it was a very productive meeting, and that you know, as time goes on, we'll be going forward with other meetings and getting together, and hopefully we'll have some action shortly as far as doing some cleanup in the city.
Thank you. Steve?
Yes, I also had read Mr. Brown's letter. I certainly did talk to the city manager, and as far as, we do review the email. Obviously, we make the calls and find out, and obviously there was a meeting with him. There was obviously some legal talk as well. So, I just have confidence that, we would, have addressed and resolved this issue, but unfortunately, this gentleman still comes before us. I do have a couple more things. I know that we had received a memo regarding the red light. It's interesting to note that I think this is the first time I've seen where the vehicle impound is actually greater than the red light camera violation fees. That's a first. But I do know that this has a lot to do with a few issues. One certainly being the road reconstruction project going on. And I think the other is just awareness. We have seen some cities that seem to be moving forward and they're addressing getting rid of theirs. I'm not saying that's a discussion we want to have. We obviously, there have been some adjustments, even the timing cycle, for instance, was addressed. But the idea was that this particular dollar amount that we would obtain from this, we would see decrease over time, and that's, would be fair to say. With the upcoming storm season, I noted some work being done on the drainage systems. My hat's off to those folks doing that work, especially in this hot weather. I've noticed this down Bay Boulevard where I drive every day, so I want to thank those folks in the city regarding that. We are coming up with the storm season here quickly, so I know a lot of that work is going on. I've seen some information recently regarding paying for smart city initiatives, and we were talking about that one of our previous meetings, but there are some ways this looks to be going forward in many places around the country. The PPPs, or the public-private partnerships, the MSPs, the multi-stakeholder partnerships, and of course smart cities are consulting with companies all over and looking at their planning and maintaining certain sustainable city models. And I did notice an article, I think Tom has talked about this before. Interestingly enough, when we look at solutions that have to do with the utilities and monitor distribution systems, that there has been some increased technology. I was reading about the Itron solutions that I guess talks with what we have already. As you indicated, this provides real-time actionable data, and that's what we were looking for. I think you even made reference to that when these particular events occur, that the timing is crucial. And some of this technology that's out there, I don't know what these costs are, but they seem to tie into the SCADA systems, et cetera, to do exactly that. So it was interesting to see some of that information, things that you talked about already. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, wait, one more thing. I just wanted to say with the upcoming July 4th, thank you to the volunteer firefighters. Looking forward for the hot dog sale, $1 a dog. So thank you. Got to tie into good news, too.
All right. Let's move on to the consent agenda then. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Moving on to council business, we're going to flip items 2 and 3 and take the comprehensive annual finance report first. Mr. O'Neill.
Yes, as you're aware, the city, in accordance with Florida law, conducts an independent audit of all of its financial statements and procedures every year. We have retained, by approval of the City Council, Powell and Jones as our certified public accountants, and Mr. Richard Powell is here tonight to present the findings of the audit.
It's a pleasure to deliver the annual audit of the City of Port Richey. The city prepares a comprehensive annual financial report, which is very commendable in that it has very detailed information in it. I will discuss the parts of it that apply to the audit, and I'm sure you will review the other parts of it on your own. As always, I'll review the highlights and then be pleased to answer any questions, address any concerns of the City Council. On page 1 and 2 is the audit opinion. It states that it's a complete audit of the city, completed in accordance with applicable auditing standards that include the financial auditing standards and the government auditing standards. So there's 2 levels of audit review. In an audit, what you seek is a clean, unqualified opinion that states that the financial statements are an accurate reflection of where the city stood at the end of the year, what transpired financially during the year. You have that unmodified, highest level of assurance, which is a good reflection on the quality of the financial records and practices of the city. The next section is the management's discussion and analysis, some required overview financial information on the city, but due to the fact that it is derived directly from the financial statements, I'll ask that you also review that on your own, and I'll go directly to the pertinent financial statements. And the first one would be on page 24, the balance sheet of the governmental funds. The city has 2 types of funds, governmental funds and enterprise funds. So on page 24 is the balance sheet of the governmental funds. The city's governmental funds are the general fund, the CRA fund, and the capital improvement fund. These are fund accounting statements, and fund accounting is somewhat like cash accounting. So on this balance sheet, the total assets of these funds were $5,129,326, and you see that the largest amount of those are in cash, unrestricted and restricted. The total liabilities, $1,135,851. The total fund balances, these are cash reserves, $3,993,475. If you look at the bottom in the first column, you have various categories of fund balances, but the unassigned and general fund, which is $1,627,157, is basically the unrestricted reserve of the city that is under full control of the City Council. I always equate how much does that relate to your regular general fund expenditures, and it relates to about 5 months worth. So it's at a good range. It shouldn't be any less, but it's at a good range. Okay, the next statement on page 26 is the revenues and expenditures statement on these funds. The total revenues for these funds were $5,398,777. Total expenditures, $5,147,009. And so, and after the transfers in and out, you had an increase in fund balance of $261,272. And if you look to the prior year comparison, that's about a $220,000 increase from the prior year. An area I would like to point out to you, which I'm sure you're aware, if you look in the CRA fund, the expenditures exceeded the revenues and transfer in from the city by $549,619. And when you review those expenditures, most of them are operating expenditures of the city. Then if you look at the total ending fund balance of $1,306,043, if that were to recur without any change in the future, it probably would deplete that fund balance in about 2.5 years. So yes, it's an area to be aware of. Okay, the next statement on page 28 is the balance sheet. Now it's called a statement of net position to make it purportedly easier to understand. They changed terminology of the enterprise funds, and you have two enterprise funds, the water, sewer, and the stormwater utility. The purpose of an enterprise fund, the intent of it, is for it to operate fully off of user charges, so you don't have to utilize any of your regular general revenues in it, and you do that. The total assets, you have substantial capital assets, were the $13,332,341. The total liabilities, $3,904,797. The net position, net equity, $9,421,762. And if you look at the unrestricted net position of $551,908, that is approximately the same as that fund balance in the governmental funds. So, and as you can see, that it is substantially higher than the prior year. Okay, on the next page, page 29, the total revenues were $3,130,364. Expenditures, $2,941,431, which includes depreciation. And so after depreciation, interest on the debt, you were a positive $58,883, which increased the net position to the $9,421,762. So it is a good objective to fully cover all of your cash expenditures, your debt, and your depreciation, and in this year you did. Although it was close, it was only plus 58,000, but you did fully cover your true expenses of these funds. And the only other area that I neglected to point out on the balance sheet, the page 28, is that auditors, financial analysts look at the relationship between the current assets and current liabilities, and the ratio you hope for it to be at least 2 to 1. Your current assets 1.7 million, current liabilities 1.1 million. Your ratio is about 1 to 1.5. So it means you don't have the liquidity that you can just easily, you have to manage your receivables and payables, and so it is good to build up, to build that ratio up so that's hopefully 2 to 1, and then it makes operations much more efficient. Okay, in the notes and disclosures, you have many of them, but the ones I would direct you to on page 42 is a table that shows your capital assets. Again, these are divided into governmental and into business type. The governmental assets on the cost basis, $13,274,774. Accumulated depreciation, $4,549,587. And so with what this tells you, your governmental assets are approximately 1/3 depreciated, which is average for probably a city your size that I'm aware of. So that your assets aren't extremely old, but they still have $4.5 million in depreciation that's not funded, which all cities and counties can't fund it. And your enterprise fund, the cost base is $18,544,504. Accumulated depreciation $6,905,728. That percentage is about 37% depreciated. So, okay, so financially overall, you had a successful year, you were slightly stronger at the end of the year than at the beginning of the year. The other parts of our audit are the reports regarding our audit procedures required by government auditing standards. That's on page 85, 86. And then government auditing standards requires audit work regarding internal control over financial reporting, compliance with various laws, regulations, agreements. This report is a report without any findings. Again, a good, clean report. On page 87 is the management letter required by rules of the Auditor General. In the management letter, in addition to addressing specific issues, we include findings and recommendations that are not material to the financial statements, but areas with which we wish to make you aware. We had no reportable findings in the prior year. In the current year, we have a finding regarding CRA, Community Redevelopment Agency, payment of salaries. For many years, the city has maintained a CRA as provided in Chapter 163 Florida statutes. The plan, which was most recent dated 2009, provides that the CRA may use funds to pay the city for salaries and wages of city employees who work on any of the CRA projects described in the plan. In the current year, the city paid approximately $785,000 in salaries and benefits for city employees. We were advised that these allocations for these employees were developed in prior years and are not currently in written form. Section 7.0 of the plan requires that the city shall create and maintain records of the extent of each employee's time spent on such work, and reimbursement or payments shall be based on such records. We therefore recommend that the city develop such the time records or allocation method for the ensuing year and adjust the payments as appropriate. Okay, the annual report filed electronically with the state is in agreement with the audited financial statements. The city complied with Florida statutes regarding investment of public funds. We determined that the city had not met any of the conditions described in Florida statutes that might result in a financial emergency. We did financial condition assessment procedures. I've given you the highlights of those. We noted no deteriorating financial conditions as defined by a rule of the Auditor General. Did not disclose any further items that would be required. We very much enjoyed the challenges and experience with this audit of the city. We appreciate the helpful assistance of city staff in completing our audit, and also the generally high quality of the city's financial records and internal controls.
Thank you. Any questions?
I do, but I'm sure others do too. Do you guys want to start over there, or? Okay. All right, well, I'll try to hit on a couple of things before I get to my main question, which was what you just talked about. You mentioned a little bit more strength in the end of the year as opposed to the beginning of the year. So as far as the, and let me turn to that page here. You mentioned with the unrestricted that usually that would go along with a 5-month operating number. So this 1.6 million would generally represent what you thought would be appropriate, that particular amount?
Yeah, it's at the 5-month. I usually recommend 3 to 6 months.
Okay.
The higher number of months, the smaller you are, because you could have an emergency, a storm or something that would require a lot of cash, and so.
I was following as well on page 26. You indicated down there in the center bottom 2 particular numbers, the net change in the fund balances,
Yes.
which was the negative 549,000. And you also mentioned that end of year fund balance at the 1.3 million. Was there something specific there? I was trying to follow, and
That was the CRA fund by
Right.
itself, and that if you had excess expenditures of 500,000 for with 2.5 years, that ending fund balance would be negative.
So prior to, because we have spent a lot with projects, et cetera, and Pam would know this as well, you know, these funds are there to use, obviously.
Sure.
And with that, you're gonna have some years where that use is gonna be higher. This certainly may be an example of that. I'm not sure what the previous numbers were going back a couple of years, but as you indicated, at that particular rate, at 2.5 years, we'd be out. But what exactly, we have an average number that's coming in as well.
Well, it is the net number.
Okay.
That's the net number. And the only, yeah, and it, you know, and I just point that out. I didn't call it a deteriorating financial condition or anything, just kind of pointing it out.
Okay.
Is that, but I know that when you adopt budgets, you're not going to spend all of it, or
Right,
you
right.
know, you'll have a balancing. So it's kind of like looking at it at the end of the year and saying, making an observation.
Now, you also mentioned on page 29 that the change in net position,
Yes.
58,000. Did you regard this number as being relatively low?
Well, it is commendable because that includes depreciation, which isn't a cash expense, of $465,000. So when I see a city able to still be positive there after depreciation, after interest, then it's good. Obviously, you know, auditors and accountants like those numbers to be higher and reserves to be larger.
And then a broader discussion. I think this is an area that goes back some years, and that's when we talk about the particular CRA paid out as being, we've always said over 700,000. In this case, it's 785,000. Now, I'm certainly not indicating that these funds are ill-spent. That's not the case. We know, going back years ago, this was set up, I believe at the time, it may go back to Ellen, but in any case, it goes back a ways, and she incorporated an attorney who set this up.
Sure.
Now, where the actual percentages were drawn, and when I talk about percentages, what I mean is these are percentages related to, you know, whether it be the police department, whether this be IT, whether this be, you know, there's several areas where these numbers were determined, whether they be 20%, I think some numbers were 50%, some numbers were 80%. Now, where those numbers actually came from and how those were derived, I'm guessing that, Pam might comment on that, because I know others are going to have the same thing to say, and I've said this all along. If we take this particular number, and as we get close to doing the budget again and establishing things, you know, we've said we have to wean ourselves off of this number. We have to start to make an attempt, not to see it get greater, but to see it get lower. You know, we're artificially low on our tax rate as it is. I believe 5.3 something. With that said, if you take this 785,000 and use that, you know, obviously this tax number would be much greater, and we have neighboring cities that are above 8 now. But I'm not saying that it shouldn't be used, but that we, you know, I don't know where we would look to provide for that number being lower. Obviously, if you look at the particular system that was set up in those percentages, that's existed for a while. Now, whether or not that served as, you know, as you mentioned here, there should be records that relate to, well, that's the only record I know of. Now, Pam might speak to some other records or how that would maybe have initially been set up and possibly changed, or maybe in fact it's never been changed.
And I thought Mr. O'Neill's response, when you read it, was appropriate, because basically we will set up a system to, and just, things change, and so you don't have to do it every year. You don't have to punch a time clock, but you could have a time study or something, just, and then, and the, you know, the key is that the payment should relate to to some record.
Go ahead, Pam. I know you wanted to talk to that.
When the CRA was restated in 2009 is when we really first started putting the salaries in the CRA to the extent that we do currently. At that time, we tried daily timesheets, and I think I still have stacks of them in my office somewhere, where we tried to do that with everybody in the city. And we found that it just didn't work. And especially with crewmen who might be working on a project and they weren't even aware that it was a CRA project. We were expecting them to keep accurate records of CRA time versus other time. Myself, you know, I'm interrupted probably every 15 minutes, and to keep an accurate record of what I do by 15-minute increments is totally impossible. So we did try with those, and we were finding it wasn't working, so we did reach out, as we stated in this letter. We reached out to at least 3 cities. I talked to Tampa, and they were the most helpful. And they gave us advice on how to analyze each job classification and come up with a percentage. And we did that at that time with Ellen, and we came up, and we did look at every job classification and analyzed it and came up with a percentage at that time. We did not do a written document to document what we were doing, and that obviously was a mistake. And since 2009, when we really first started that, we have somewhat looked at the classifications, but we've also, as you know, needed to lean on the CRA. And as we've talked about in the last 2 budget years, we've talked about we need to wean off of that. We did look at the classifications. Again, we did not put it in writing. This year, with the upcoming budget, that is going to be one of the big projects we're going to do. We are going to sit down and write up an official document with the job description for each classification and justification on what percentage we do select. And this will give a guideline for the next years to follow to create that trail.
And, you know, I think it's important because if you look at the actual number, and that number today is 1.3 million, and the use thereof. Look, I'd like to see it come down. I'm not sure how or what discussions we have to look at trying to bring it back down. You know, we have challenges. We have we have more decreasing revenues, it seems, than we have increasing revenues. And, you know, we even had a workshop some years ago and talked about looking at increased revenues, and that's not been the case. But I think each council person here would say that, you know, money taken away from the CRA certainly has to supplement staff work. But I think if we evaluate that fairly, also those dollars are helping pay for things that, you know, taxpayers want to be done as well. So it is quite a balancing act, and I hope we'll be able to have some of those discussions after maybe we incorporate a document that we may be successful in bringing that down, because I just don't think we're going to be fair to the citizens here in keeping this tax rate low when in fact we're, you know, going to have some revenue question marks, and certainly this CRA is one. We're now closer to $800,000. That's all.
Can I make a brief comment?
Yes, sure.
I wanted to mention that I think we've positioned ourselves well with regard to some of the salaries and expenditures out of the CRA that were used for utility operations. There is a number in there that are used for salary and benefits and other operating expenditures, including, for example, the water plant generator. Those all come out of the CRA. With your action and your positioning to put the city in a better financial position with regard to utility rates, we should be able to wean the utility system off the CRA in the next year. That's a good number and a good start. The other discussion that I would recommend that we have is a discussion, as I mentioned to you in the budget message, on new revenues. The city has a stormwater utility, and since its inception, I believe in 2003, the rate has remained constant, and the expenditures have not. And it, based on other operating stormwater utilities in the area, I think a discussion on the stormwater utility rates would be helpful. We also may wish to consider other new revenue sources, for example, a street lighting fee. Pasco County has a street lighting fee as a part of their utility, so does the city of Newport Richey. And right now, all of the costs for street lighting are paid by the general fund, and I believe a portion is in the CRA. And so that's another discussion that we could have to help us with regard to the total CRA budget. And I'd look for some of your comments and perhaps some direction on that.
Okay, anyone else have any questions? Yes, Nancy?
Quick question. You mentioned that we did better at the latter part of the year. Was there one thing that you could see when you were auditing that kind of put us toward that trend?
I think possibly that I misspoke. Yeah, I said probably at the end of the year you were better. The results as of the whole year, you had increased, and honestly, you know, that is a good question. In the present year, in the governmental funds, you were positive 261,272. The prior year, it was only 49,000, and your with revenue was $100,000 lower. Your expenditures mainly in the general governmental area were lower than last year substantially. That's the main one. That although your revenue was $100,000 less in these governmental funds, you improved $220,000, and it was through reducing expenditures in the general governmental area.
Okay.
Terry?
The one thing I noticed was on page 4, we've talked about this, but the most notable changes in the water and sewer fund 2013 operating results were that the cost of purchased water was $366,941 in 2013 compared to $161,000. Could that be where we are getting hit with some of this money?
I might defer to your financial staff, or who would actually know. But yes, your purchase water cost was substantially higher, and I don't know if that was a rate increase or a usage increase. I think it's probably.
Speaking.
It was probably more a usage increase in 2013 for the water rather than a rate increase from Newport Richey.
Yeah, just a couple of quick things on that. Since that figure has occurred, we've both negotiated a lower rate, and we're using now considerably less purchased water than we anticipated. The irrigation rates are having the effect of putting the message out with regard to conservation, and so although our revenues are less than anticipated, so are our expenditures, and the utility is operating well, particularly in consideration of the fact that it's satisfied its obligation to the pooled cash fund of the city with regard to unrestricted reserves, the money that was borrowed some years back. So I would defer to the auditor, but I think we've improved our financial position, particularly with the rate structure changes and the indexing of the utility rates that will occur starting October 1.
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Good, thank you.
All right, then moving on to the city financial report, Mr. Pete Chatzel.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd also like to thank the council for giving me the opportunity to be here tonight to make this presentation to you. If I could, just for a moment, in commenting on the CRA fund and just in some of the comments that had come up, I did want to point out, and I know that you are aware of it, but for the fiscal year 2013, in the CRA fund, you had actually budgeted to overexpend the revenues by about almost $1.5 million. So that the fact that there was an excess of money spent over monies coming in of about $549,000 was only about a third of what had actually been budgeted to overspend in that CRA fund. And in the report that I'm going to be going over for the first 6 months, it was the same situation in 2000 and in fiscal year 14, where you have budgeted a fairly large deficit in that CRA fund. So I just wanted to point out that even though you did overexpend, it certainly was something that you had budgeted for and you had expected to actually spend more, which has been a trend for the past several years. You have budgeted a deficit and haven't spent quite as much as what you had originally intended to at the time that you adopted the budget. With that said, the report that I'm presenting or going over with you tonight it's a report on the first 6 months of the fiscal year 2014. And the report that I believe it was in your packet. I guess the good thing is that it's somewhat shorter than the 100 pages that you had to go through for the CAFR. And but the first page has to do with the general fund, and in an effort to be somewhat concise, or I shouldn't say concise, but to be somewhat condensed, there isn't as much financial detail in this comparison, but I feel that it does bring forth some good points for the general fund. Just to kind of set things, just set the stage, so to speak. For the full year, you have budgeted a deficit of $457,000 in the general fund. So over the first 6 months, if everything was perfect and you were spending money just as you had budgeted, you would have a deficit of about $228,000. In looking at the actual results for the first 6 months, there's actually in the general fund there's an excess of revenues over expenditures of about $324,000. To put that into a better perspective, since you are getting your ad valorem taxes pretty much all in the first few months of the fiscal year, I put a column, the very far right-hand column, it attempts to show the income if you were getting the ad valorem taxes, instead of all at one time, so to speak, if you were getting them throughout the year. And in looking at, if you look at that scenario, you would have brought in about $1.9 million in revenues, and the amount that has been expended, also using that same concept of and the only area that is really affected in the expenditures is the money that you fund over to the CRA for the amount of the ad valorem taxes that basically pertain to the city's share that you fund over to the CRA, and you fund that immediately. So the city's share was almost $291,000, which is that represents the pretty much the total amount that you had budgeted for the year. So in that far right-hand column, I'm just showing as if you had only paid half of that, half of the city's share into the CRA fund. And but to get to the point, even if you were getting your ad valorem taxes throughout the year, in the general fund, you still would have had a little bit of an excess of revenues over expenditures of about $25,600. That excess does come in spite of the fact that on the red light ticket revenues, through the first 6 months, you've only received about 51% of what you had budgeted. So for the first 6 months, you were expecting $663,000 in red light camera revenues, and you only brought in $335,000. So there was a shortfall of what you had budgeted of about $328,000. But even in spite of that shortfall in the red light camera revenues in the general fund, you still have taken in more revenues than what you have expended. So what I would conclude is that even though you have you do have a budget, you have a deficit budgeted of $457,000, I don't believe that you are on target to hit that, to hit that type of a deficit. If all else stays pretty much the same as it has for the first 6 months. Are there any questions in regards to the general fund presentation? The next page covers the CRA fund, which is what has been discussed for a good part of these presentations. Again, to set the stage for the entire year, your original budget was you have budgeted deficit in the CRA fund of about $1.2 million for fiscal year 14. So over a 6 month, for the first 6 months, you would expect that you would have a deficit of about $608,000, or basically half of that total deficit. In looking at for the CRA fund for the actual results through the first 6 months, revenues were $683,000 and expenditures were $653,000. So you have about a $30,000 excess of revenues over amounts expended. Again, using that similar concept that I just mentioned on the general fund, where if you were to prorate the ad valorem taxes throughout the year rather than getting them all in the early part of the year, in the far right-hand column of that CRA fund presentation, you would have brought in about $347,000 of revenues and spent about $654,000. So, which would mean that for the first 6 months, you would have had a deficit of about $307,000. Again, even looking at it using that approach, that $307,000 deficit is still less than the $608,000 that if you take one half of the actual budgeted deficit for fiscal year 14. So again, to put it in somewhat more straightforward terms, you're not spending as much in the CRA fund in fiscal year 14 as you had originally planned also. On the bottom part of page B, there's a similar comparison for the Penny for Pasco fund, and that's a little bit somewhat more straightforward. Again, in keeping with the other two funds, you were expecting to spend some of your prior year surplus in the Penny for Pasco fund. There's a budgeted deficit of about $213,000, excuse me. And through the first 6 months of the year, you actually do have an excess of funds coming in as revenues as compared to the amount expended of about $55,000. So you have there's about a $161,000 favorable variance in that fund. Going back to the CRA fund, one of the comments that I was going to make, but I think it's been very adequately discussed, is the fact that although I think the CRA funds, I don't think you should have a large balance in that fund. I don't think that's the intent of a CRA fund. I do agree very much with the comments that have been made that as far as weaning yourself off of using that to pay a fairly large percentage of salaries. I do think that is something that you do need to be addressing, the fact that you had spent $785,000 of salaries in 2013. So as has been discussed, as far as looking at alternative revenue sources so that you can be supplementing your general fund as you begin to move those salaries out of the CRA fund over into the into the general fund, you're going to need additional sources of revenues, as far as looking to the future in order to cover those added salaries that you're going to be moving into the general fund. On page C, it's a budget comparison for the water and sewer fund. And on the revenue side, the 6-month budget was about $1,770,000, and the amount of actual revenues for the first 6 months are about $1,268,000. So they're looking at the comparison of budget to actual. There is about a $501,000 shortfall as far as what had been budgeted for the amount of revenues. There is very much, in looking at the expenditures, there is an offset to the fact that although the revenues are down about $501,000, when you look at the expenditures and compare the actual expenditures of $1,274,000 to a 6-month budget of $1,769,000, in the water and sewer fund, you have a favorable variance in your expenditure budget of about $494,000. So you pretty much have an offset there. Revenues are down, but the expenses have also been reduced. So the end result is that for the first 6 months, you're operating at a small loss of about $6,000. What I've done in the presentation on this page here on the water and sewer fund is to basically give you the presentation, which I'm using pretty much the same accounting methods as you would see in the audit, so that in looking at that $6,000 loss for the first 6 months, if someone was to come in and do an audit for the first 6 months, it would be, I think it would be fairly close to that number. I don't think it would have to be changed very much. I have just a few comments there on in addressing the water and sewer fund. On number 3, as I said, the water treatment plant budget includes a capital outlay of $157,000, and about total has been expended of about $2,000. In the admin costs, I think this is an important thing for you to know. The admin costs does include about $223,000 for the asset depreciation, and that $222,000 is about half of what the total depreciation would be for the year. So in looking at that loss, it does include $222,000 for the asset depreciation. And the only other fund that I'm presenting here, that on the bottom of page C has to do with the stormwater utility, and that fund is operating at about a $7,500 profit for the first 6 months. The revenues are a little bit below budget by about $10,000, but in looking at the expenditures, they're about $32,000 below budget. So you're operating at about a $7,500 profit, but you have a looking at the budget to actual, is about a $22,000 favorable variance there. The last page of my report on page D it has to do with looking at the city's cash position, and one of the things that I have been bringing to your attention for I think it's several years now, going back to probably 2010, was and I believe Tom had mentioned it earlier, that there was a point in time where the general fund had advanced over $1 million of basically working capital cash to the water and sewer fund. And that came about because the water and sewer fund was just spending more than it had been taking in. And I'm pleased to report that for the first time since about 2006 or 2007, those funds, the water and sewer fund, is not having to rely on getting that subsidy from the general fund. On page D, the very last caption, I have the amount due to general fund from the water and sewer fund. And it just so happens that the last time that I made this type of presentation to you was at the end of 2012. And at that point in time, the water and sewer fund had been subsidized by the general fund by about $291,000. At the end of September 2013, that subsidy was down to about $120,000. And now, as of March 31st, 2014, it has been, in essence, paid back. So you have reached a point where you're not, in essence, having to borrow from the general fund in order to fund the water and sewer fund operations. The other, I think, a very positive comment is that on that same report on page D, the total cash at the end of March was about $5,028,000. Of that $5,028,000, about $1.7 million was that was cash that you had to spend for specified purposes. So the amount of the city's unrestricted cash at the end of March was at $3.2 million, which is the most that it has been, I think, since I've been making these presentations to you. So again, just to somewhat recap, I think that shows that you've made a lot of progress in the last 4 years. And when you go back to 2009, I looked at that a couple of days ago, and in 2009, both in the general fund and in the water and sewer fund, you had a deficit in the fund balance portion that's not restricted. There were very, very large deficits in those two funds, and when you look at those two funds now, as was brought out in the audit, it's about $1.6 million in the general fund, and it was about $380,000 in the water and sewer fund. So that has come full circle. I shouldn't say full circle. I mean, it's been very much turned around from a very negative position to a very positive position. So I think that's very good news for the city of Port Richey. Those were all of the comments that I had for you, and I'm sorry it's such a dry presentation, and you've had to hear, two reports on your finances tonight, which is probably double duty.
Thank you. Again, any questions?
I do.
Yes, Steve.
Pete, thanks again. I certainly, in looking at what you just described with the unrestricted cash number as being very good, obviously the highest you've seen. When you did go back and mention looking at the general and the 1 million transfer to the water and sewer, that I think this is large in the sense that March 31st, 2014, the 120K was paid back. These were questions that I know other council members had as to when that was going to be paid back, and now here we are. It's been done. I want to just quickly look at, there's reference on page C, and I'm looking specifically at the middle of the page where you make reference that the general government expenditures are over budget due to paying non-recurring insurance premiums, and this goes along with the number that we see there in the budget variance being $20,000. I mean, whenever we talk about particular non-recurring insurance premiums, is this something that you would refer to staff in looking at insurance in general and what is actually, I'm just looking at how that might improve, let alone the, also I might as well lay this number out there, the 152,442 referenced in the administrative billing section in the variance there at the 6-month variance number. Those two numbers I think you described.
With, well, in regards to the insurance premium, that's really just a function of at what point in time are you having to pay that premium on your policies. And so in the city's case, it just so happens that you're paying those premiums for the entire year. You're paying them early on in your fiscal year. Those amounts are not going to be recurring throughout the year. So at this point in time, you've spent more on insurance than what you have budgeted. But at the point in time that you get to the end of the year, all that will have caught up because you pretty much have paid your insurance for the year, so to speak. So
Now, have we seen, Pam, any increases that correlate with those, as he indicated, just like the ad valorem, when you've got a heavy concentration of that at a particular point in the year, also when you talk about insurance, maybe the same things, but are these any flags that maybe premiums are going up? We've seen healthcare premiums go up, but what about some premiums that go along with this?
Actually, we'll know on the 20th. We have a
Okay.
meeting with PRM on the 20th. I think we're looking at maybe a 10% increase for next year, but they will have the actual figures to us on the 20th.
So we, certainly looking at increases, but decreasing revenue, and obviously a few ideas have been thrown out, and I think it's going to be an agenda item upcoming that we may refer to some of these revenue ideas that have been shared. The other number that you mentioned, the 152,442, where does that fall as far as administrative billing and the variance there? Is there anything that you caution going forward in that particular?
I guess that probably isn't as easy to necessarily explain. When you do your budget, the budget is being done on a cash basis. So you're budgeting all of your capital outlay, you're budgeting the amount of your debt, the amount of the debt service. And what Pam tries to capture is that when we do the financial audit, the amount that is paid on the debt is not recorded as an expense because you're actually paying down on your debt. So instead of it showing up as an expenditure, it shows up as your debt being less. You budget for this particular year. The amount that's budgeted for capital outlay is probably like around $240,000. But in the audit, we take the capital outlay expenditures they get added to the amount they get added to your balance sheet, since those really are assets. So what we're trying to do from a budgetary standpoint is we're almost trying to juggle two different concepts, trying to budget from a cash flow point of view, but also anticipate the fact that when you come down to the end of the year and that gets put into an audited financial statement that goes to the Auditor General, you'll be showing asset depreciation. So I guess the best that I can do there is that when you pull out the capital outlay but also put in the asset depreciation, it's for that particular line item in your budget, it's creating that negative number. And the best that I can, I guess, offer you is the fact that you almost have to look at the bottom line from the standpoint of is the water and sewer fund operating at a profit or at a loss? Because we're putting all of that asset, all of that asset depreciation is going into one line item, as opposed to really being spread out amongst each one of those departments. So does that help a little bit?
Well, I know also the reference in the total expenses and the number 495,000. You made a comment, you know, as those revenues decrease, we've also seen some expenses decrease. Well, I might argue that when we take into consideration some of the expenses noting to increase and obviously revenue decrease, and I point to one of those spots because you outlined it on Section A when we talk about the red light tickets. And although we've had the impact of the construction going on, I think that number looms pretty large when we look at, you know, almost $330,000. It's very hard to judge where specifically that number would be if we had not had construction going on now. But, you know, we have the north affected by that, the south affected by that, those directionals. And I know there's some time specifications on here, but certainly that equates to, you know, what we're seeing as well. And I guess my point is maybe we'll bring this up in a meeting. Maybe it's something we can talk about, you know, when we say decreasing revenues, but also some increasing expenses. When we talk about the healthcare expense, talk about insurance expense, we talk about the local gas tax decrease. There are several items that I think we can consider, and it's a little scary. You look at these particular numbers, I think that's eventually got to have a big impact, but I know others have things to say as well, but those are just my thoughts. But
Yes.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Again,
You know, just a
appreciate it.
comment on that. If you look at, you know, what we brought in red light camera fee amount, 335,264 was our actual, and then look what our expenses are. I mean, it's really not a big difference. Just want to point that out.
Right, as far as the red light camera fees and the amount that you pay to the state.
Yeah, we're putting our employees through all that work, and what kind of bang for our buck are we really getting? And it is controversial, just a point I wanted to make.
Well, this may be why some cities have brought it up, and, you know, they're actually making moves to get rid of it.
Food for thought.
Quick question, Tom, have they given you any indication on how long those red cameras are, how much longer that construction's gonna take on that corner?
We should be back in full operation in September. Am I correct in that, Sergeant?
I think that's what was on here.
Yes, I believe that's what was in your report.
The information I was given yesterday was the remaining camera that is currently not operational should be back fully functional between September to November at the latest, but it won't be before September.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, anything else from anybody? Thank you again for your time and your effort
Are you
and your
welcome.
insight.
You're welcome, thank you.
All right, the next item is the 2014 local mitigation strategy. Mr. O'Neill.
Yes, you have before you tonight an annual review and approval of the City of Port Richey local mitigation strategy. The committee meets several times every year to review and approve the implementation. The City of Port Richey adopted a resolution becoming a member of Pasco County's plan in '03, and this is relative to the city's community rating system. I want to point out that for the last several years, Ms. Donna Rose in the Finance Department has prepared and updated this report. I think she does a fine job on it, and we're recommending approval.
All right, discussion.
Motion to approve.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any other comments, discussion?
No, Ms. Rose does a good job on this every year, and continues to do so. It's a lot of work.
All right, we've got a motion and a second. Any comments from the public? All right, seeing none, then are there any other final comments before we vote on this? All right, motion and second, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, it passes. That's it for the agenda for this evening. There's just one other, before we adjourn, I've got one other matter I forgot to bring up earlier, and that is, we had previous discussions about the, looking at kiosks for the boat launch,
Yes,
Nick Park.
yes.
And I just wonder where we're at on that, and are you ready to bring something in front of council?
I have not completed that yet, and I
Okay.
will give it a priority.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have anything else?
Had there been, it noted that there were 32 homes when we talked about those repetitive loss areas. Is that program still active? That I know Port Richey, we had a lot of activity there. Was the last maybe in 2000, I forget when the last would have been, but I don't know if anybody knows, but you know, we had quite a few, I mean, I see quite a few in our area that were done. I just wonder if that's still active. Are people engaged in that, or
I believe so.
is it?
I
Okay.
have a quick question too on that. That's supposed to go, the repetitive loss goes for what period of time? It's not the lifetime of your home, is it? It's a 10-year period, is it not?
I'd have to look into that to give you an answer on it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, because every time I get my, Tammy's suggesting it is 10 years. In 2003, my 10-year would have been up, but I keep getting this little notice that tells me that FEMA lets me know that, you know, how much money was spent on my property each, you know, in 1993. And I keep looking at that going, why do they keep writing that? Is that something that they're holding on to and for total loss over a lifetime?
I think it is.
You do?
I do, but I'm not certain, you know. At one time, I think it was considered 5 years, but I think they changed it. I don't know.
I think it'd be good to look into that, and in our next newsletter, you know, let our residents know exactly what the rules are.
All right. If there's nothing else, we stand adjourned.
Very much. Ah.